Good morning, everyone. I would like to call our forum to order, and I would like to thank our experts and our colleagues for being here with us today for this important forum. There's no doubt that Russia interfered at our 2016 election and targeted 21 voting states' voting systems, and we can expect them to return. My colleagues and I created this task force to understand what we can do and what can be done to prevent a future attack. 218 elections are just over a year away, and there's more to do to safeguard our elections. The panelists here today are experts in running elections and implementing security measures. Look forward to hearing their perspective and learning about how the Congress can assist in their efforts. Foreign interference in our elections is a threat to our democracy. We must work together to ensure that elections are free, fair, and secure. I thank you all again for joining me in this important conversation about how to work to secure our country's election systems. I would now like to turn it over to my colleague and friend and co-chair, gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you very much, and let me welcome our witnesses to this task force on election security meeting. As this task force convenes for our second public forum focused on securing our election infrastructure from further foreign interference, I'm concerned that with each passing day, we as a country are not moving forward with security preparations for upcoming elections. It is clear to everyone that during the 2016 campaign cycle, Russia used tactical cyber hacks and misinformation campaigns to attack our election systems and undermine confidence in our democratic process. Based on past attempts, we know that a country like Russia, with a leader like Putin, they will be back with ultimate goals of destabilizing democratic institutions. Therefore, it's imperative that we not only understand the threat posed by outside actors, but also the systematic and programmed challenges faced by state and local election officials. We cannot ask our state and local election officials to take on a state actor like Russia alone. During our September Task Force Forum, we heard from former Secretary of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson, and former DHS Undersecretary for the National Protection and Program Directorate, Suzanne Spalding, about the national security risk and vulnerabilities to our election infrastructure. We also heard about how the federal government can help state address these risks and vulnerabilities to ensure the interferences that occurred in 2016 do not happen in future elections. Today, we will hear from those who have made a career of ensuring that our election systems remain open, fair, and protected. I look forward to hearing about their state's efforts and what they are undertaking to secure election infrastructure and whether the Department of Homeland Security is providing the assistance states need when they need it. So with that, Mr. Co-Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I would now like to introduce our experts, but I would be remiss if I introduce the Secretary of State from the state of Rhode Island, because Mr. Langevin is our congressman from Rhode Island, and I would ask him if he would introduce his Secretary of State, which I believe that you held the position before that.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a matter of fact, I did. And first of all, I want to echo the comments that both Chairman Thompson and Chairman Brady have mentioned with respect to how important it is that we secure our elections against foreign interference from foreign powers, as we saw with Russia. And clearly, we cannot take the cornerstone of our democracy ever for granted. And I appreciate the work that this task force is doing to better secure our election systems up and down the board, as well as the work that our witnesses in particular are doing on the front lines. So I thank you all for being here. And just by way of introduction, a few words that I'd like to offer in welcoming Rhode Island Secretary of State Nellie Gorbea. Nellie was elected in 2014. I held the position from 1994 to 2000 for 6 years before I ran for and was elected to to Congress. And during that time, one of our major accomplishments there was overhauling the entire election system. We had the oldest voting machines in the country, and we brought in new optical scan voting equipment. Well, I thought I was a pretty active and hardworking Secretary of State, but I can tell you that our Secretary of State, Nellie Gorbea, has exceeded all of my accomplishments and built on so many of her own, and had brought great vitality and vision to the Office of Secretary of State, including overhauling the election system once again, upgrading with new form of optical scan voting equipment. So no small feat, Mr. Chairman, but she's brought a new sense of vision and energy to the Office of Secretary of State. It's a pleasure to have her here today. You will find her, I'm sure, to be both expert and, again, insightful in what she has to offer and what we're doing in Rhode Island to better secure our election systems, whether it's our voter registration systems or election equipment itself. But we are grateful for her expertise and all the work that she's doing on behalf of the state of Rhode Island, and I know that we will benefit from hearing from her testimony this morning. And I want to welcome Secretary of State Nellie Gorbea.
I thank the gentleman. We will also hear from Edgardo Cortés, Commissioner of Virginia Department of Elections. Mr. Cortés has worked in elections for more than a decade and is currently chairman of the Elections Assistance Commission Standards Board. Finally, we will hear from Tom Hicks, Commissioner of the Elections Assistance Commission. The Election Assistance Commission is an independent, bipartisan agency that assists state and local election officials with elections administrations. And Mr. Hicks is currently serving as the Commissioner's Vice Chair. I will now turn over to our distinguished experts and first ask for Rhode Island Secretary of State, Nellie Gorbea.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Congressman Thompson and Congressman Brady, for your invitation to discuss what Rhode Island is doing.
Push your button on the microphone. No? Push the button and come on.
It's green. Oh, it just was too far away. Okay. Thank you, Congressman Thompson and Congressman Brady, for the invitation to discuss what Rhode Island is doing to protect against cyber threats to our elections, both foreign and domestic. I commend you and Minority Leader Pelosi for your leadership in creating this task force that focuses on the health and security of our nation's elections. I would be remiss if I did not, of course, recognize my congressman and thank him for his introduction, Jim Langevin, who, as you know, as he was saying, before coming to Congress, served as Secretary of State in Rhode Island. Nearly 2 decades ago, he was a visionary that led the early adoption of voting technology that replaced the ancient Shoup lever voting machines with state-of-the-art paper-based optical scanning equipment, and led to such wonderful introductions as bilingual ballots and many other innovations. Interestingly, Rhode Island's small size and rich history of civic engagement has facilitated its role as an innovator in elections technology. And as early as 1936, Rhode Island was the first state to use voting machines at every polling place across the state, not just in major cities, as was the custom of the time. Right now, throughout the United States, our elections infrastructure faces several challenges. First, although this is not the case in Rhode Island, many elections across our country are being run on equipment that is either obsolete or near the end of its useful life. Second, our public sector employees and systems at the state, county, and municipal level are ill-prepared to handle the looming threat of cyber attacks. Finally, our country is facing a very real threat presented by foreign actors conducting activities that serve to erode the public's trust in the integrity of our elections. These attacks are real and are focused on undermining our representative democracy. These challenges to our elections have been handled in a variety of ways because elections are organized and run differently in every state. Nonetheless, I believe that what we have done in Rhode Island over the past 3 years can provide valuable insight into the challenges and opportunities that elections officials face in this area of increased cyber threats. In Rhode Island, while I serve as chief state election official, elections run in coordination and collaboration between my office, the Rhode Island Department of State, and the Rhode Island Board of Elections and local election officials with their boards of canvassers. My office, the Department of State, maintains the central voter registration system. The CVRS, as we affectionately call it, is a singular voter registration database used by all local election officials across the state. A separate agency, this Rhode Island State Board of Elections, oversees Election Day operations and is responsible for the security of the voting equipment. Meanwhile, local election officials and their boards of canvassers run the polls on Election Day. Our collaboration and cooperation are a key ingredient to successfully running elections. Over the past year, we have developed new collaborations to include federal partners, specifically the Election Assistance Commission and the Department of Homeland Security. So how has Rhode Island handled the three challenges I described above? First, we addressed the topic of equipment. When I took office in 2015, our voting equipment was on the brink of total failure. Thankfully, when I confronted the problem with the leadership of our state, they took the issue seriously. And Governor Gina Raimondo, Speaker Nicholas Mattiello, Senate President Paiva Weed, and the membership of the General Assembly all supported the purchase of new paper ballot optical scanning machines. This translated into an investment of nearly $10 million over the next 7 years, not a small feat for a small state. The EAC was instrumental in providing us with key advice and counsel in the development of our request for proposals. As a result of all of these efforts, Rhode Island entered the 2016 election cycle with newly secure voting machines that had 4 layers of security and encryption. Similarly, we invested in more secure data storage and cloud-based systems. We signed up for the assistance to states under the Critical Infrastructure designation by the Department of Homeland Security to further protect our central voter registration system. But investments in hardware and software cannot be used effectively if government doesn't have the human resources that can manage and operate them. My second challenge is one of building the capacity of the public sector to manage and respond to cyber threats in our elections. In Rhode Island, I have increased my office IT staff by 40% to ensure that we have the technical expertise in-house necessary to respond to the ever-shifting landscape that technology presents. This investment in our state workforce has also allowed us to deploy online tools and resources that not only make our elections infrastructure more secure, they make it easier for voters to participate in the process. Over the past 2 years, we have implemented online voter registration, acquired electronic poll books, and have just started the implementation of automatic voter registration. It is my firm belief that improving the integrity of election systems can be achieved while simultaneously improving access to voting. At this time, I would like to stress how important it is to have better communication between the Department of Homeland Security and our country's chief state election officials. Being able to quickly disseminate information on potential threats and respond effectively is critical. The National Association of Secretaries of State was able to persuasively present to the Department of Homeland Security this issue. And as a result, DHS has begun the process of providing chief state election officials like myself with the required security clearance to effectively manage the cybersecurity of elections. It is important to acknowledge the significant paradigm shift in elections that the issues of cybersecurity have made us face over the past couple of years. Cybersecurity is at the forefront of elections conversations at every level of government across the country. Just last week, I convened more than 100 of Rhode Island's election officials and IT staff for a summit on elections and cybersecurity. Congressman Langevin provided a briefing during the summit. And one very important takeaway from that meeting was that with the issues of cybersecurity, there isn't a destination or something we need to achieve specifically, but rather a continuous process of assessment, improving of our systems, and mitigation of risk. This is also a problem that requires us as election officials to bring together all stakeholders, regardless of political affiliations, to continue to identify threats and work on solutions. At a recent workshop I participated, organized by Harvard University's Belfer Center, IT leaders from Google and Facebook discussed cyber threats. They commented that top technology companies of our country regularly get together on cyber threat information, despite being fierce competitors in the private sector. They have realized in the private sector that we need what we need to do in the public sector. Our elections are only as strong as the weakest link in the chain. Thus, in Rhode Island, I have focused on ensuring that our elections officials and staff at every level have the information and support necessary to minimize cybersecurity threats. As cybersecurity threats continue to evolve and become more sophisticated, states need additional funding and resources dedicated to the security of election systems. These funds are critically needed for third-party assessments, testing procedures, and strengthening of IT capacity. In many states, they also need funding for the hardware of the voting system themselves. In addition to this federal-state collaboration, investment in our public sector IT employees and much-needed equipment upgrades, Rhode Island also took a very important step when the General Assembly passed legislation providing for risk-limiting random post-election audits to verify the results. These will ensure that Rhode Island randomly reviews the results of elections to ensure the integrity of the voting system and the entire process. In order for our elections to work, Americans need to trust in the integrity of our election systems. Since our founding, the United States has been a beacon of democracy in the world. We cannot allow the public's trust in our government to deteriorate. This is particularly important as we seek to strike a balance between life in a free and open society and responding to new cyber threats in this world of big data and eroding privacy. And to this, the delicate balance between the states' rights and federal involvement, we need to deal with this complexity. The federal government should recognize that it can play a critical advisory and support role in securing elections infrastructure, while respecting the fact that elections are the responsibility of state and local election officials. Congress can play a critical role by, yes, providing resources to the states so that we can be prepared to face any cybersecurity challenge, but it can also serve to provide oversight on the challenge between security measures that are needed to safeguard our democracy and the need to preserve transparency and access to information to protect our open government. Thank you again for the opportunity to present testimony on the work we are doing in Rhode Island and how the federal government can work with states to ensure our nation's election systems are secure and our democracy is safeguarded.
Thank you, Secretary. Now we will hear from Commissioner Cortés.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the task force. I appreciate the invitation to speak with you today. I'm Edgardo Cortés. I'm the Commissioner of Elections in Virginia, and so in this role, I serve as the Chief State Election Official for the Commonwealth. I lead the State Department of Elections. So Virginia has 133 local election jurisdictions and over 5 million active registered voters. During my tenure at the department, we have focused on using technology to create a better voting experience for eligible Virginians and reduce the workload of our local election officials, while also increasing security and accountability in our processes. So there's a lot that we've done in this area overall, but today I'm going to focus on our recent voting equipment decertification, which I was asked to discuss with the task force today. So again, in terms of our modernization efforts, one part of that has been an effort to strengthen the security and reliability of voting systems in the Commonwealth. As you may know, Virginia decertified all of our paperless direct record electronic voting machines on September 8th, 2017, which is 59 days prior to our upcoming November election. We now require the use of optical or digital scan voting equipment for all elections in Virginia. This step was not taken lightly, and we realize this placed a financial administrative stress on the election system. It was, however, an essential step to maintain the public's trust in the integrity of Virginia elections. This administration and the Virginia election community have faced many less than ideal situations in the past 4 years. We've addressed all of these in a similar manner, which is a determination to ensure that all eligible Virginians are able to vote with confidence. The Virginia election administration ecosystem is structured very comparably to a number of states where the local election officials administer and mostly pay for elections. And the state supervises and coordinates the work of those local officials and ensures uniformity in the process. Regarding voting equipment, the state's responsible for certifying the voting equipment, and local officials are responsible for choosing their equipment and purchasing it from the state menu of certified options. Our state certification requirements rely on the existing federal criteria set by the EAC. And at this point, once the system is certified, no additional testing is currently required by the state to retain a certified status. First efforts to curtail the use of paperless DREs in Virginia began actually in 2007 with a new state law that prohibited subsequent purchase of DREs. However, that law allowed localities to continue using their existing DREs until the end of their useful life. 7 years later, when I was appointed commissioner, approximately 114 of our 133 localities were still using antiquated DREs. And I believe you have a map in your packet showing that statewide usage. In the 2014 general election, we experienced significant issues throughout the state due to continued use of old voting equipment, and it highlighted the need for an expedited transition away from paperless systems. As part of our efforts to address the problems, Governor McAuliffe proposed $28 million in the state budget for new voting equipment during the 2015 legislative session. Unfortunately, unlike our colleagues in Rhode Island, our General Assembly did not provide that financial assistance and left that responsibility for new voting equipment to our local election officials. So not surprisingly, as the DREs grew older, complaints about them, complaints related to them began to increase. Some of you all may remember in 2014, one of your former colleagues, Congressman Ridgel, had a election where many of our voters down in Virginia Beach experienced significant issues with trying to cast a ballot in that election. Subsequent to that, the department conducted a full review of voting equipment issues, and during that review, we discovered that one of the certified DRE machines, the WinVote, was operating with wireless network capability turned on. We asked the Virginia Information Technologies Agency, our state IT department, to assess equipment security for those WinVotes. Even with no voting experience, a staff member at VITA was able to manipulate the WinVote machine remotely from another office. Once we discovered that issue, that necessitated immediate action. And even though the June primary was a few weeks away, we had approximately 20% of the precincts in the state using that equipment. We had no choice but to decertify that equipment. There was no money in their local budgets for the immediate procurement of new voting equipment. The department contacted the affected localities and informed them of potential decertification. We also contacted the local election official organizations and the voting equipment vendors to work through the process of transitioning to new equipment. In response, again, to those findings from VITA, the WinVote was decertified 55 days prior to the 2015 June primary. And in spite of many comments predicting certain failure, which I assume are similar to the comments you received about concerns with transitioning to voting equipment, thanks to lots of teamwork between state and local officials, the June primary was administered without issue related to the new equipment. Most important factors in the successful transition were the partnerships with the individuals and entities, those local election officials, the vendors, local governments. And so as part of the McAuliffe administration's focus on cybersecurity, the department's been focusing on strengthening that voting process over the past 4 years. And so we've continued to encourage remaining localities that had paperless DREs to transition to new equipment as quickly as possible. We fast forward to this summer when the department learned that DEF CON, which is an annual hacker convention, planned to have a voting village at their conference. The public reporting out of that conference created some significant concerns for the department, including when our agency CIO alerted us that one of the passwords for a voting system in use in Virginia was being posted online and made available to the public. Based on that, we knew that immediate action was necessary in advance of the upcoming election. And so the second map that you have shows the DRE usage in August of this year. As you can see, there are only about 30 localities that had not updated their voting equipment, and we're still using one of several DRE systems. That map also shows some real consequences of the decision to not provide federal or state funding for equipment. Generally, it was our poorer and more rural localities that were forced to continue using antiquated and problematic voting machines because they couldn't afford new ones. And while we knew the transition was possible because of our prior experience, we did face some different challenges during this process. For instance, we now needed to test 5 different voting systems, but we had no way to compel vendors or locals to provide equipment for testing. We were able to, through our relationship with the locals, obtain 4 of the 5 types of voting equipment. However, one piece of equipment, the Hart E-Slate, we were unable to receive either from the localities or from the vendor, which refused to provide it. On the other hand, we had very helpful partners during this process. Again, the State Association for our local election officials, VRAV, wrote to its membership acknowledging that any voting equipment that was almost 2 decades old was unlikely to withstand any review under today's IT security standards, and recommended that all localities move forward as quickly as possible with the purchase of new equipment. Verified voting also served as a resource and provided the department and VITA with helpful information about the equipment vulnerabilities they had identified over the years. And so with that, about 10 weeks prior to our upcoming election, we received preliminary analysis. We had asked the Information Technologies Agency whether they'd be willing to confirm the accuracy of results cast on the machines in the event that future results were called into question. They told us they were not willing to do that. The week following that discussion and that preliminary analysis, all DREs in the Commonwealth of Virginia were decertified by the State Board of Elections. And so today we stand 2 weeks from the upcoming election. All affected localities have new voting equipment in place. In-person absentee voting began, as scheduled, approximately 2 weeks after decertification. Again, none of this would have been possible without the great work of our local election officials who struggle with a consistent lack of financial resources. Deputy Commissioner Liz Howard, our Chief Information Officer Matt Davis, our partners at VITA, Tracy Howard, who was the head of the Registrars Association until recently, and Katie Boyle from our Virginia Association of Counties. Verified voting, and of course EAC. Our experiences with voting equipment decertification have gone smoothly because of the teamwork between state and local officials, national organizations, state organizations, voting equipment vendors, and our army of election officers and dedicated officials across the state that administer the election. So although it's clearly possible to transition quickly, doing so is less than ideal. And so I want to bring up a couple of recommendations that I think Congress needs to look at to make it easier to manage these issues in the future. Number one, as I'm sure you've heard from all of my colleagues across the board, funding elections is a shared responsibility of local, state, and federal government. Congress needs to ensure that sufficient federal funding is available for states to procure and maintain secure voting equipment and increase security of all election systems. That needs to be an ongoing commitment and not the one-time infusions of resources. The EAC has been critical to ensuring that a baseline set of standards for voting systems, adequate testing protocols, and certified test labs are available to states, and Congress should retain and fully fund the exceptionally important work that the EAC does. In order to ensure the use of secure voting equipment in the future, Congress should consider requiring the federal certification of all voting systems used in federal elections. This federal certification protocol would ensure a security baseline and still allow for states to require additional and state-specific testing. Federal certification should also be required for electronic poll books, which are not currently subject to any federal guidelines. If requiring federal certification is not a realistic solution, then at a minimum, Congress should empower and fund the EAC to expand their current voluntary voting system guidelines to include guidelines applicable to electronic poll books, and also incorporate periodic security testing as a prerequisite to maintain certification. And then third, again, the work of our local election officials is paramount in this, and there are a number of excellent training programs out there, but establishing some sort of accreditation system for election administrator training to ensure that individuals responsible for this, dealing with this most fundamental American right, are equipped with the appropriate skill and knowledge set to do so. Thank you again for inviting me to share our experiences in Virginia with voting equipment decertification. I'm happy to answer any questions from the committee members.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Tom Hicks.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for inviting me to this task force meeting. I spent 11 years in this very committee room as a staffer, and it's a pleasure to be back here. The U.S. Election Assistance Commission, EAC, was created in 2002 and charged with improving the nation's election administration system. In 2017, this includes helping election officials protect their systems against cyber and physical threats. The 2016 election and its reported nation-state attempts to breach state election systems reinforced our nation's understanding that this protection must leverage all available resources. To this end, the EAC has helped election officials understand and leverage both state and federal cybersecurity resources as they evaluate the 2000 elections and prepare future elections. Most notably, the EAC has been a key player in helping election officials understand and leverage the Department of Homeland Security designation of elections infrastructure as critical infrastructure. A DHS designation of something as critical as infrastructure brings increased federal resources into a space to provide for increased protection of cybersecurity systems and more effectively information sharing. The EAC has worked extensively with the DHS to help best design and distribute these resources and work alongside election officials and private sector election technology companies to help them understand the designation and how to leverage the resources that it brings. This help has included two types of activities. One, facilitating, mediating, and participating in meetings between election officials, DHS, and other key players in the cybersecurity space. And two, producing and participating in the production of educational and fundamental documents and materials. The EAC is the nation's clearinghouse for election administration. In this role, the EAC played the key conduit between election officials, DHS, and other players. The EAC helped ensure that the election officials were able to inform DHS with critical operational information about election administration and its systems. Also, the EAC facilitated and helped mediate the formation of one of the key means by which the critical infrastructure designation functions, the Government Coordinating Council, GCC. To do this, the EAC brought state officials, local election officials, and DHS together and structured four separate occasions in 4 separate locations: Albany, New York, Anaheim, California, the EAC headquarters in Silver Spring, Maryland, and Atlanta, Georgia. Additionally, the EAC will bring the nation's private sector election technology companies together to help facilitate the creation of another key component of critical infrastructure designation, the Sector Coordinating Council. For each of these meetings, the EAC paid for individual travel for the attendees of the meetings, dedicated staff time to planning and attending the meetings, while sometimes expensive. These efforts paid off, and the GCC was formally formed this month. To quote a DHS official public statement from a conference in California, we DHS wouldn't want to be in this critical infrastructure without the EAC. Bringing the key players together was only half of the EAC's critical infrastructure-related efforts. Quickly after DHS made its designation, we at the EAC learned that there was a great need for educational materials about critical infrastructure and its potential effects on EAC stakeholders, election officials, and administrators. To help our stakeholders understand the designation so that they could leverage the newly available federal resources, the EAC produced educational documents, blogs, and materials. We produced a white paper titled Starting Point, U.S. Election Systems as Critical Infrastructure, a glossary of cybersecurity terms designated to facilitate conversations between the states and DHS, and a series of blog posts that break down the complex topic of critical infrastructure in an easy-to-digest post, all available on our website at eac.gov. The EAC was also a critical resource for DHS as DHS attempted to understand the topic of U.S. election administration. While preparing documents that DHS would go on to use as formally educational materials for its own staff, DHS continues to reach out to and leverage the EAC's knowledge and expertise concerning election administration. DHS still uses these documents that were built with EAC's expertise. A critical infrastructure designation is an impactful event, but the EAC also understands that this designation does not in itself secure the nation's election systems against cyber threats. Knowing this, the EAC participates on a cyber defense of election systems as that critical infrastructure is a component of a broader cybersecurity plan. As part of this broader cybersecurity plan, the EAC produced and distributed educational materials that was invited to be a key player in the cybersecurity readiness planning meetings, such as a tabletop exercise that helped New York prepare for its modern cyber threats. Some of these documents include 10 things to know about selecting a voting system, considerations for implementing voter systems with COTS products, 10 things to know about managing aging voting equipment, 6 tips for contingency and disaster planning, securing voter registration database checklists, and I brought copies for the commission, for the task force, if they sure need to. A couple of EAC commissioners have worked with the Belfer Center at Harvard to develop a tabletop playbook and training for states to take and use. We hope to work with private sector partners like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and others to provide services to local election officials to provide additional cybersecurity help and to initial response communications playbook. Lastly, the next generation of voluntary voting system guidelines, VVSG 2.0, that will guide the EAC's testing and certification work was adopted by the Commission's Technical Guidance Development Committee. The next step is to share the guidelines with members of the EAC's Board of Advisors and Standards Boards, who will review and provide comments on the guidelines, which were improved in September. Following the board reviews, there will be a 90-day period for public comment on the guidelines. These guidelines will guide the standards for voting machines for years to come. These guidelines are used by the states, are used by 47 out of 50 states to certify their voting equipment. The EAC is proud of the work that is done to help the nation prepare to defend itself against cyber threats, and is excited to continue this most important charge. I yield back my time and would be happy to answer any and all questions the task force may have.
Thank you, Commissioner. I just have a few questions to Secretary Gorbea and Commissioner Cortés. I've been advocating to the task force that we need to solve this problem. How we could solve this problem best is with more money. We need money for machines, money for poll workers, money for cybersecurity. However, we know that voter registration databases are a particular target. What can the federal government do to help you with your voter registration databases? Madam, you're first.
So I think that, we're seeing the beginnings of what I think is very helpful, with the Department of Homeland Security providing us with some assistance in terms of checking our computer systems at the Department of State, not just the central voter registration system, since there are multiple ways to actually access our infrastructure. And so just a couple of weeks ago, we had our regional DHS representative meet with us and provide his employees that are working with, that are the representatives for Rhode Island. And so that kind of ongoing help from federal officials who honestly have a lot more depth of information about what we should be looking for is critical. Opportunities to come together as election officials to discuss this is also really, really helpful. And so whether that be through the EAC, which I think has done a great job of, supplementing and providing opportunities to learn, to interact, and to grow as election officials in collaboration with the Department of Homeland Security. I think that fostering that kind of collaboration of those two agencies is absolutely critical. And then finally, I think that, this is a topic that by its very nature, when you look at security issues, it's all about keeping secure and keeping out of the public eye. Congress serves a particularly important role in terms of the oversight of those activities. I am concerned as an election official who really believes strongly in open government and transparency in government that we not lose sight of what makes our country great in terms of the openness of our systems. And so having Congress oversee, as you do in other areas of foreign intervention and around the globe that maybe can't be disclosed immediately publicly, but doing it as well in this area of elections is a real counterbalance that we need to have you serve as.
Commissioner?
Mr. Chairman, I think in terms of securing our statewide registration systems, I think there's a couple of things. DHS has been, I think our relationship in Virginia with DHS has been very productive over the past year. We have had them on site a number of times. We have taken advantage of a number of the cybersecurity offerings that they have. We are in the process of scheduling additional reviews with them, and I think Secretary Gorbea mentioned the kind of depth of knowledge they bring to supplement what we have at the state level, and has really added a lot to our program. And it's really a matter of we have a lot of technical expertise on staff at the state. It's really what indicators are we looking for? What things may we have, is it possible that we may have missed? I think having those federal resources come in and assist with that has been exceptionally helpful. I think in terms of kind of overall, the EAC does have ability to issue guidance. Statewide databases are a HAVA requirement. The EAC does have ability to issue guidelines in terms of meeting those requirements, and so perhaps some baseline best practices for cybersecurity, for securing our statewide registration systems might be an appropriate move and a way to take that work that the EAC has been doing in coordination with DHS and really take it to the next level. And so again, I think the coordinating council, I'm pleased to be a member of that group that's been put together with a lot of assistance from EAC to DHS, but that communication flow. And so we are participating currently in a several-month pilot with the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, right, to figure out how to best identify cybersecurity threats for election officials, how to take that information, make it easily digestible for election officials as part of this overall effort under the critical infrastructure designation. So I think a lot of those pieces are moving, but I think what we have found in Virginia, and certainly what a lot of our colleagues have found, is it is a very resource-intensive undertaking to make sure that our systems are secure and to make sure that we're staying ahead of threats that are coming our way. And so I think, our efforts working with private entities as well, not just Google and Facebook, but companies like Akamai, have really helped us to have an overall, view of security in terms of our system, and hopefully other states will take advantage of those federal resources.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Hicks, always nice to see a former employee on that side of the table, smiling. My question is about the EAC and its ability to help state and local election officials with cybersecurity issues. I know the Homeland Security Committee is working on this issue, but could you tell us what the EAC has done on helping states and counties understand cybersecurity issues, and what more would you like to do if you had additional resources?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's always a pleasure to see you. One thing I wanted to start off with there was a little talk about 21 states being scanned with interference with the foreign actors. Make no mistake, it's all 50 states that were scanned. And it's just a little bit of the foreign actors or whoever jiggling the handles and trying to get in. But some of those states were prepared enough that they weren't able to get in. As we prepare for the 2018 election cycle, we want to make sure that from voter registration lists to voting machines to securing the voting equipment after the election to election night reporting. So from A to Z, that all those aspects are taken care of. So the EAC has gone out to a number of states. My colleagues and I fly around the country on a weekly basis to talk to election officials across the country about their systems and how they are handling their security protocols. We've worked with DHS over the last year to get information out to the election officials through alerts and through other tasks, convening with bringing election officials together to talk about these issues. Most recently, we were down in Atlanta where we formed our coordinating council, but I think there's a lot more that needs to be done because I believe that not only are foreign actors looking to mess with our elections, but I believe that there are folks within our own country who are looking to meddle in our election process.
Thank you, Commissioner. And I'd like to recognize Mr. Langevin for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I want to thank all of our witnesses for your insightful testimony here today and the work you're doing to better secure our election systems and processes. So, Secretary Gorbea, if I could, I would like to start with you. Again, thank you for making the trip down to Washington. Always a pleasure to have you here, and I just want to recognize once again all the great work that you're doing to secure election infrastructure in Rhode Island. And under your direction, I know again the Ocean State is becoming a leader in election security and an example for other states across the country to follow. So you've told us about some of the steps that you've taken already to secure Rhode Island's election infrastructure, updating election hardware and software, and by the way, no small feat, as you mentioned, the cost of $10 million for new voting equipment, and it really did require a whole all hands-on-deck approach, and it's a testimony to your credibility and how seriously everyone in Rhode Island took your call to update the equipment, as well as having the governor and the speaker and the Senate president on board, and the members of the General Assembly. So for that, we're grateful. Beyond that, though, you're again hiring IT professionals and training election officials, and I'm again thrilled that the General Assembly recently passed a bill providing for those risk-limiting post-election audits. I think that gives again, another step that we can give the public confidence that the votes that are cast are accurately counted and reported. But can you please discuss some of the challenges that you've encountered in making these reforms and how the federal government can provide further assistance in overcoming these challenges?
Yeah. The challenges that we face at a statewide level have to do with building the capacity of our elections officials and infrastructure. So there's the hardware, which everybody talks about, and I think is a real one in terms of the hardware and software, but there's also a human aspect to the problem. And so you have election officials, IT officials at the local municipal level that really need to be brought on board with some of this information. We just started this in Rhode Island on Friday. We did a cybersecurity summit on elections, and we had almost every single city and town represented, over 100 people. I think it speaks to the hunger that there is in the communities to learn what exactly is the problem and how can we manage it. Being able to rely on these federal agencies like the EAC, to go to them and to the Department of Homeland Security for advice, for counsel, for best practices, so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time we do something like this, is absolutely critical. And in fact, we did have our Rhode Island designated person from the Department of Homeland Security there that day. Every single time that we're looking at doing something in cybersecurity and elections administration and improving things, we look at the EAC because they have all this information about what's happening at the national level. We absolutely need those resources there at the state and local level.
Great points. And you touched on what was going to be a follow-up question in terms of what, in terms of how do we help the train the trainers, if you will. So I won't have to touch on that, but all points well taken. And I think it's important to recognize that it's important to know who the contacts are, whether at the EAC or the Department of Homeland Security. Again, just to know that when you need assistance, or just know what might be available out there, and you already have a name of the face, or you have somebody on speed dial, so that you know who to go to, and you're not kind of trying to figure it out in the middle of a crisis, or when the pressure is on, and perhaps you're in the middle of an election or close to that. So hopefully other election officials will follow suit and reach out and make those contacts ahead of time and draw on whatever resource they think are best for their state. Because again, I think that's important to maintain local and state control on these elections. The federal government in designating election systems as critical infrastructure, the thing that does is it provides a way that it makes you a priority customer when there's a need for assistance. That's all. So let me go to Commissioner Hicks, if I could. So in your opinion, what are the biggest vulnerabilities in our election infrastructure right now heading into the next elections, and what are some of the simple steps that states can take to address these vulnerabilities, and what federal resources are available to help them? If you could elaborate on that. I know you touched on some of that in your testimony.
Thank you, Congressman. One of the biggest vulnerabilities I see right now is the aging voting equipment. It was purchased after the Help America Vote Act was passed in 2002, which we're celebrating 15 years in less than a week of the law being in effect. And the equipment that was purchased 15 years ago has come to the end of its life cycle. I had the honor of going out to Clark County in Nevada to see some of the equipment that they've purchased, which is they're going to be using for their next election cycle. But a lot of states don't have those resources to be able to do so. But we want to make sure that when we go to purchase new voting equipment, which has been falling onto the states right now, that we make sure that those who want to vote independently and privately, as the law says, are not going to be disenfranchised by the purchase of that new voting equipment. So as we look to have paper trails put on these new machines to make sure that those who need to be able to use those machines can all use those machines. One of the more simple things that I see out there is basically just securing the equipment physically with locks, or not having passwords that are 1, 2, 3, 4 out there. I think working with DHS has been a little bit of a treat, as they are such a large agency. But I also wanted to make sure that with critical infrastructure being designated by DHS, it does fall under the whim of whoever administration is in there. Secretary Johnson designated it. Secretary Kelly kept it. I don't know what the view of the new nominee is on designating critical infrastructure. But I wanted to say that as the EAC is a bipartisan commission, it's best that we remain involved in those issues. It doesn't help that our budget is constantly under attack, where it's being cut when we have more responsibilities right now. And it doesn't help that there's still talk of eliminating the agency. But I think that as long as we are around, we will do the best that we can to move forward with this.
Well, if I have anything to say about how long the EAC is on, it's going to be around for a very long time. I know we need the EAC and the resources that you bring to bear, and I am grateful for the work that you and the team at EAC do every day to better secure our election system. So thank you.
Thank you.
Last question I had, and I have several, hopefully we'll come back to perhaps a second round, but for Commissioner Cortés, I was struck in your testimony when you identified relatively quickly how quickly the Commonwealth of Virginia decertified the DRE equipment and then moved to more of a paper ballot, optical scan type system. So can you identify and give advice to other states that may be looking at a similar decision, and how you're able to get new voting equipment in place so quickly and how many municipalities or jurisdictions had to actually get rid of the DIR equipment and bring in that new equipment that did meet new certifications? And can you give guidance to some other states out there that may be faced with a similar thing? 'Cause that's sounds like a very compressed time frame to bring in all new phone equipment and training the trainers and such, and get the public ready to use them.
Yes, Mr. Congressman. In terms of our timeline, it was an exceptionally condensed timeline. We started, like I said, about decertification happened about 2 weeks prior to the start of absentee voting. I think, in terms of this latest round of decertification, we had about 30 local jurisdictions out of our 133 that between early August and now have transitioned to new equipment. So that's it's a sizable portion of our state that has had to do that. I think, the most critical component in all of this has been our local election officials, right? Our general registrars at the local level who have worked just an amazing job of getting things in place, working with their local governing bodies to secure the funding for the new equipment, and then going through the process of figuring out how to deploy that equipment in a timely fashion. And so when we started this at the beginning of August, we had a discussion with all of those impacted locals to let them know what was going on and start working with them as to how they were going to do this. So that included communicating, again, with their local governing bodies who control the budgets for the localities. We did a lot of work with the voting equipment vendors. We have 4 vendors in Virginia that are, have equipment that is currently certified, digital scanning equipment that's out there. And so we worked very closely with them and had a discussion with them at the very beginning to ensure that they all had both not just inventory on hand to assist the locals, but also that they had resources to assist and train the trainers and to print sufficient ballots for everybody, just kind of the whole run through. And so I think on that front, the vendors were exceptionally helpful. A lot of them provided a lot of creative financing options for our local governments who had not planned to make this expenditure during this fiscal year. And so some of them have delayed, some have even delayed payments, have delivered equipment, are not going to receive any payment until the beginning of our next fiscal year to allow those local governments to appropriately budget and bring the resources in. So it really has been a team effort to get it all underway. In Virginia, we have an election. We have a major statewide election every year, and so our election officials are very used to, as soon as we're done with one election, we kind of switch gears and get ready for the next and figure out what we need to do to make that happen. So it really has been a team effort, but a lot of it has fallen to our local election officials who, again, have done just an amazing job.
Well, I must say, knowing what it takes to bring in new voting equipment, getting rid of the old and bringing in new, I am incredibly impressed with Virginia and how quickly you were able to move to do that, to your credit and to Governor McAuliffe's credit. Again, no small feat, and thank you for your insights here today. Everything, for all of you, your testimony has been very helpful. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank the gentleman. I'd like to now recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Val Demings.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much to our witnesses for joining us today as we discuss this very critical issue. You all know how important protecting the integrity of our election system is. I think it's the kind of last line of defense for leveling the playing field for people living in this country, regardless of who they are, how much money they have in the bank, where they live. Their vote should matter and it should count. So thank you so much for the work that you are doing. I'd like to ask each of you, should we be demanding more from the elections-related vendors? And with that thought in mind, what are some of the challenges you or your colleagues in the field have experienced when it comes to purchasing election equipment and services? And to what extent is the next generation of election-related products. As we've heard, 15 years, the equipment is at the end of its life cycle, being built with cybersecurity in mind. So I'd like to hear from each of you. And Commissioner Hicks, why don't we start with you?
I've had the honor of going to several of the manufacturers of electronic election technology over the last couple of years, and they have a lot of different products that they have out there that aren't being purchased because of fear. For instance, one company has a way to scan, use your phone to scan your ballot in, so you can vote from home, go to the polling place and scan that in. But states aren't buying that because they're afraid to look at new technology. But I think that with our new voting, the voluntary voting system guidelines that we're putting out, they're going to be innovative enough to allow for flexibility for the manufacturer of machines, but also making sure that those who have disabilities can still vote independently and privately. We hope to vote on those by the end of or the middle of next year, once they're approved by our two boards. But I think that as we move forward, we have to look at technology but not be afraid of technology. We're not going to be voting on the internet anytime soon, but we want to make sure that it's secure, private, and independent.
Thank you. Commissioner Cortés?
Yes, thank you. From the perspective of the vendors, absolutely, I think they could be doing more on the security front. I think especially with the equipment the older equipment that's out there, security, if it was thought about at all, was really an afterthought, which is what we saw on the equipment we just recently decertified. So as we head into the hopeful approval of the, VVSG 2.0, I think that will hopefully give vendors a new paradigm to look at and really incorporate security up front. But I think the, new technology, and we are big proponents of technology in Virginia and using it to make it better for voters and provide a better experience. I think the obstacle we face, particularly when it comes to voting equipment or voting machines, is that you have to balance the need for security with the need for a secret ballot. And so a lot of the security protocols that we are able to put in place and take into account when we're dealing with things like online voter registration or other aspects is a lot harder to do, to maintain that auditability of equipment when you have to maintain a secret ballot. And so I think the vendors are kind of in a tough spot, but I think the vendors can and should be doing more around security. And I think that the states need to be demanding that vendors do more, right? I think part of this has been that election officials' security is not, cybersecurity up until recently has not been an across-the-board concern for election officials. Something we certainly been looking at for a number of years, and other states have too, but it's not been an across-the-board concern. And so without a push and a demand from the customer base to say, you have to include security as part of one of the primary things in the equipment that you provide us and the tools and things that you develop for us, it just hasn't happened. And so I think now that there's this new attention, I think the vendor is going to start to see that. My big concern from a cybersecurity standpoint is that we are seeing, we talked a little bit earlier about registration databases. We are starting to see a lot of vendors pop up offering cybersecurity tools and all sorts of things to election officials in the same way that when the passage of HAWA happened, we had all of these vendors kind of pop up overnight and offer this amazing equipment, and then the vendors went out of business and the states were kind of stuck. Holding the bag with equipment that was not great and vendors that were no longer there to support it. And I see the same thing starting to happen now on a cybersecurity front. So I think that's something that we need to be aware of as we're talking about resources and really, providing that education for election officials so they can discern what are good products from what are not good products, and what vendors are committed to actually making this work and providing good products for election officials versus people that are in it to make a quick sale and then are going to disappear from the landscape.
Thank you. Secretary?
Congresswoman, so I can't say more forcefully that how much I agree with you. I mean, elections, of course, are that place where one vote equals one vote, whether you be rich or poor. You have equal value at the ballot box. And so it is so critically important to safeguard the safety of our elections. Now, technology can be hugely helpful in many, many ways in terms of increasing access and making sure that more people vote. And I think in Rhode Island, that's part of what we've tried to use it in that way. But it can be a problem when left solely just to market forces, as my good colleague from Virginia was saying. And so the federal government absolutely can help us greatly by, rather than having every state reinvent the wheel in terms of security guidelines, really help us press upon some baselines for security. 3 years ago, nobody was really thinking about these things other than sort of as an afterthought. Cybersecurity issues are now, the flavor of the month, a really important issue, and they're not going to go away. So being able to, yes, press the private companies to be more forthcoming, but to do so, understandably so. I mean, each of them has proprietary software, which is what is part of the challenge. And it goes to that balance, right? We need some oversight and some safe spaces for oversight by the people in this particular market. And federal players like the EAC, like the DHS, can help the states greatly in helping us, in a safe spot, in a safe space, provide oversight over whether certain technology is really doing what it's supposed to or not. I hear from the vendors that it has to be done in a timely manner. Absolutely. That goes to the issue of resources. And we really need to invest on this because going back to our first point, there's nothing more important in terms of government's functioning than to have elections that people trust and can believe in.
So as you talk about these baseline requirements, then you would be in favor for federally mandated security requirements?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, we in Rhode Island could not have come up with as good and as fast a process for what the EAC already had with regards to general voting equipment guidelines. And when we developed our RFP, it was hugely helpful to be able to go to the EAC and say, can you take a look at our RFP? We may have added more things to it or taken out some stuff, but to have that resource from the federal government where they focus on this day and night was hugely helpful to my staff and to my people.
So to our two commissioners, would you also be in favor of federally mandated security requirements, those baseline measures for vendors?
Speaking for myself, yes, we would certainly. I think, in terms of cybersecurity, we have, in addition to EAC and DHS, I mean, we have that NIST, right, cybersecurity framework that's out there and available, and it's certainly something that our state cybersecurity requirements are, relate directly back to those NIST requirements. So those things already exist in the federal government, and they're happening nationally. And so it's how do we push them down to the elections community? And I do think, I don't see any problem with requiring a baseline. It's cybersecurity. It's not, when we're talking about those issues, yes, elections is a very specific realm, but when we're talking about cybersecurity, there are some baseline standards that we can look at and incorporate into our processes, and so I don't see any issue with that.
Thank you.
I don't have any issue with that as well. The other piece that I wanted to talk on was, with your question, was with the purchase of machines from 15 years ago. That was basically, here, buy this, because this is what we have. And so as we've advanced, it should be more of, this is what we need. And so when we look at purchasing new machines for the states, or when states look to purchase new machines, cybersecurity should be one of the #1 things that they look at.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. And thank you very much to the experts for being here today and helping us understand these complex issues. If we have any additional questions, we will reach out to you. Anybody? Mr. Langevin? You okay? Okay. Thank you again. And this meeting now of task force is now adjourned.